2, 3.
Hi, I'm Stacey Surratt. I'm here from the Blanchard Institute. I'm a lead therapist here at the Blanchard Institute. I have a board-certified music therapist, licensed clinical addiction specialist, and clinical supervision intern. Just wanted to talk a little bit more about this concept of family systems recovery. We talked a bit ago with Sam about the anatomy of a family system and what that really means, what it's comprised of, and how those function. And so taking a little bit of a deeper dive into that, I want to talk a little bit about how families respond with all of those different rules, different setups that we discussed earlier, and how those develop into behaviors that no longer serve the family system. We refer to those behaviors often in the scope of active substance use or mental health needs as codependent behaviors or enabling behaviors. So what is codependency? We talked a bit earlier about the scans that really highlight that parallel process between the identified patient's brain and the brains of the family members, and how that chemical imbalance really shows up on both sides. Codependency is a preoccupation, extreme preoccupation, dependency on someone else, something else, a group, an idea, something outside of self. The need to be identified with something else rather than internally identified. This is a process that's short-term driven, those dopamine reactions that only last for a short term, that lead those behaviors to continue again and again over time and drive the development of dysfunction in family systems, as opposed to being driven by chemicals that really help healthy connections and bonds. In the scope of codependency, we're talking about more than just one area. It's not just being dependent on someone for a ride or for a meal. It's really a dependency in all different areas of wellness, all the areas of wellness that comprise a healthy human being. So dependency in physical needs, in emotional needs, mental needs, spiritual needs, and even in social needs, to be able to access interactions in a healthy way with other people. All of those things being dependent on something outside of the person that's exhibiting those behaviors, rather than their ability to be internally driven and identify with their own emotional states, with their own mental states, have those independent processes going on. In the active substance use disorders and mental illness, we talk about the prefrontal cortex just not working anymore, not serving the roles that it's there to serve. When we have codependent behaviors that are really taking over that family system, those same chemical imbalances happen in those brains of the family members. That shows up with symptoms, with behaviors, and with feelings that really look a lot like the identified patient. Oftentimes when we have folks come in our front door for an assessment, it's difficult for us to determine who the identified patient is in the system and who the family member is, because there's so much parallel between the ways that the impact and the toll that these processes have and the way that shows up in physical symptoms. So we talked about the behaviors being driven by endorphins and dopamine, and those being short acting. And so as those behaviors rise, as there's an increase in the drive for a dopamine response and the drive for those short acting chemicals, what happens is the ability to connect and the functionality and the production of serotonin and oxytocin decreases. They don't stay balanced. Serotonin and oxytocin are key chemicals for the development of self-esteem, for the development of healthy connection, for interpersonal relationship to happen in a healthy way. Serotonin is produced around the production of esteemable acts, being proud of yourself, waking up in the morning and making your bed and looking at it and saying, hey, I accomplished something today. That's a production of serotonin. Having self-respect, the ability to acknowledge our own successes within our day-to-day lives and the experience that we get from other people giving us acknowledgement as well. The relationships between a parent and a child, a sponsor and a sponsee, a mentor and a mentee, coaches, teachers, those relationships that we really learn to cherish and value, where we get feedback that helps us determine how to function in our day-to-day society and feel good about ourselves, are the places where we access serotonin. Oxytocin, on the other hand, is the chemical that is referred to as the cuddle chemical. That's the one that we get from spending time with another person in an intimate relationship, in a friendship, in a loving family relationship, in social groups, in the ability to connect beyond the surface level in authenticity with another person, drives the production of oxytocin, the vulnerability to be human with another person and really be seen. So when we have a system where this disorder is present, where those short-acting chemicals are outweighing the longer-acting chemicals, and we're not able to connect in a healthy way anymore, how does that look? Some of the adjustments that happen to that happen just over time out of a natural progression of responses that family members may not even notice happening as they come. Oftentimes they're driven out of a desire to protect, a desire to preserve that family system, and a desire to make sure that no more harm passes, and ultimately create new harms of their own over time. In our society today, there is a significant increase in the experience of trauma. Trauma creates a specific set of reactions that really parallels in the brain the same things that happen in active substance use disorder or active mental health, where the ability of the prefrontal cortex to really drive behaviors and make informed decisions is impaired, and the limbic system takes over, and the limbic system is activated around the drive for responses that may look like avoidance. Rather than avoidance, they develop just out of a way to reduce risk and seek safety. Our society has a marked increase in experiences of trauma, whether that's a big T trauma, a specific event that we can point to and say, yes, that was a traumatic event, a natural disaster, a specific instance of violence, or whether that's a little T trauma, microaggressions over time, perception of an inability to fit in, I don't really belong anywhere, and the way that that impacts development over time has really increased as there's become this disconnect in our society from creating healthy and authentic relationships. The challenge with this response to trauma is it creates an isolation in a space that promotes shame. It promotes prevents the access to healthy support. It prevents the person who is experiencing those symptoms from being able to share openly about what they are, and really internalizes that experience in a way that continues to activate the limbic system and continues to fuel the dysregulation in those chemical imbalances. So what does codependency look like? We talked about that parallel process, and oftentimes that developing out of a necessity or small things over time. It shows up and we recognize it when there is difficulty acknowledging the reality of what a family system looks like, or the reality of what's happening for a loved one. When there is a compulsive need to manage, to control, to try to fix, or to help alter the course of behavior for another person. When there's the inability to really acknowledge and fully express one's own emotions, one's own feelings of guilt, of inadequacy, of fear, of hurt, of shame, and really the focus becoming external rather than being able to acknowledge those experiences and address them for yourself. And when those emotions aren't expressed, they don't go away. They build up and they manifest in different ways that become destructive to self, destructive to others, destructive to the whole family system. In the systems where there is active mental illness, active substance use, active codependency, family members' lives develop around those things in ways that may be direct, may be a direct response, and may not. Characteristics of codependency that we may recognize, some of them including lack of trust, behaviors that look like they're controlling and are really fueled by fear, taking care excessively of another person beyond the scope of what needs to be done and into the space where that person could really be doing for self. An obsessive way of thinking about the safety or the state of being of another person, making sure that they're okay, making sure that they have what they need. Difficulty communicating, not really able to have those conversations, picking up the phone and saying, "How are you doing today?" and that answer being, "Well, Johnny did this," rather than, "How am I really doing today?" Interpersonal relationship problems, difficulty with anger, with boundaries, and a host of other characteristics that just don't serve a healthy family system. In the person who is exhibiting these behaviors, there are some observable challenges in the ways that they carry themselves and interact. It's difficult to live in a value-based, value-driven way, and those values become ambiguous. I may say that my value is honesty, and that's at the core of who I am, and at the same time hold secrets and exhibit dishonesty in my efforts to protect or manage the state of being of someone else. So no longer living in accordance with values. Taking care of needs of someone or somewhere else versus someone's own needs, and inability to care for self mentally, emotionally, physically, leading to that state of difficulty determining who the patient is, who the family is, and the parallel process increasing. Really giving into some of those family rules that Sam was talking about earlier, and following by the traditions that the family has established, even if looking from the outside in, anyone could see that they're just not working anymore. Holding feelings in, difficulty expressing, not being able to share expectations, but then developing resentments when those expectations are not met. Working to control outcomes, control behaviors, control people and relationships, and oftentimes development of chronic illnesses, medical illnesses. Medical illnesses in the systems where the limbic system is hyperactivated are really driven by an overproduction of cortisol. When that limbic response is present, it is in substance use, mental health, trauma responses. The hormone cortisol is secreted in response to stress. It's the chemical that we note when we feel anxiety. It's the feeling that you get when your heart catches and something's gone bump in the night. It's the feeling of aloneness. It's the feeling of being vulnerable. And it is designed to help us defend ourselves in the crisis moment, in a fight or flight response. Cortisol is there to help us activate and get into motion, to get away from danger, to get away from threats. It's designed to be short-term, short-acting. We get away from that threat and it diminishes and exits the system, and we return to a baseline. But what happens in these family systems where there is codependency present, or there are these disordered behaviors and disease processes, is cortisol stays in the system for far too long. It suppresses the body's immune response. It suppresses the ability of the body to function as it's supposed to, and creates a whole host of other medical conditions. The immune system's no longer responding the way it's supposed to infection. Higher probability of other chronic illnesses like heart disease, GI problems, colitis, ulcers, diabetes, high blood sugar, pain, nerve problems, all associated with too much cortisol staying in the system for too long, stemming from that constant stress response of being an identified patient in a system where there's active substance use, mental health, or trauma, or a family member being in response to living in that system as well. So we use the word enabling often, and enabling kind of gets a bad rap because enabling isn't done out of an intention for harm. Really what that is a pattern of caretaking that just isn't healthy anymore. The person who is usually at the core of that enabling or unhealthy caretaking response is the person who's most emotionally invested in the identified patient, the person who really wants to pursue those instincts to protect, to preserve, and to make sure that that person is safe and okay. Unhealthy caretaking doesn't develop because of a desire to exacerbate a situation or make a disease process worse. And oftentimes the people who are in those responses don't even realize that that's what's going on. There's a fine line and a difficult time oftentimes defining what is a loving response and what is enabling or caretaking. It's a buildup, if you will, of little choices over time that create a larger scenario and fall into patterns without really a clear understanding of how those behaviors and patterns are reinforcing the disease process that's already present rather than supporting it towards wellness. Why does this happen? A sense of loyalty. Want to make sure that that person is okay and they're really important to me. A sense of love. A fear of harm. A sense of shame, a desire to protect the family, a desire to preserve those family traditions and family rules, and really just a lack of education or understanding around how to do it any other way. It doesn't feel like a choice. Oftentimes these are the statements that we hear from family members who come in, and it's never, I just wanted to help the sickness progress. It's statements like, if I don't do this, then he'll sleep outside on the street tonight. I just don't want her to get arrested. There are dangerous people out there, and I want to make sure that she's home safe. I'd rather her do it here than somewhere else where I don't know if she's safe. They're just lost. They need love and support. If I don't call in and help with that, then he might lose his job, and then he's going to lose his health insurance benefits, and then he couldn't access treatment to start with. If I don't wake him up and bring him inside, the neighbors will see him passed out on the lawn and they might call the police again. He can't afford another charge. So all of those choices made really out of a desire to help, but not understanding how it actually does the opposite. That sense of if I don't support here, things are just going to fall apart. This can come from parents helping out with a child and a difficulty determining how to shift that relationship from parenting a child to parenting an adult child to parenting a child that has a chronic illness. This happens with spouses, an inability to separate that spousal relationship where the caretaking really shifts into a role where one person is taking care of the other versus that being a coexisting relationship where each person is contributing to one another. This can even happen within a family system. There may be people who aren't blood related. Those could be friends or other supporters who just want to help and don't understand how behaviors are fueling a process. So enabling really not being defined as something that's negative or something that's hurting, more so behaviors that are impeding the identified patient from being able to do things that he or she could be doing and should be doing on their own. While these things are often done in a well-meaning way, they really cause harm and they are dangerous. What we know is preventing the crises, preventing those natural consequences really helps the disease process to progress by not putting that barrier in place where it's no longer allowed to move forward. So codependent behaviors setting in, creating a space where those natural consequences aren't allowed to lead to treatment, to sometimes jail, to other outlets where that person is able to experience an interruption in their own behaviors and in their own disease process that allows change to happen. What's interesting about this is as families respond in a system where there's active substance use, mental health, or trauma, what we're talking about is trying to manage these outcomes. trying to apply the short-term fix to the long-term problem, trying to figure out how to help or control that situation so something bad doesn't happen. And ultimately, when the recognition that it's not happening comes, there's a boundary set. I'm not going to do that anymore. You can't come back here. Without education, support, and the ability to hold those boundaries, family members also often feel guilty. I love them. I don't want them to hurt. I feel as though the things I'm doing are creating suffering, and get stuck in this cycle. I have the ability to remove that suffering by removing my boundary, and then we're back into the same cycle. What's really interesting about this is it's exactly the same cycle as the cycle of active substance use or mental health needs, where we may have an identified patient who has some old behaviors. They stop taking their meds, and those depressive symptoms really increase, which leads to some undesirable work consequences. Feel bad about it, try to fix it, try to manage those job consequences, bargaining, I will do this because that didn't happen, and then ultimately going back into that cycle. I'll take the meds for a little bit and then stop those behaviors. So the cycles of family response and active disease process really showing the parallels. The difficult part about this unhealthy caretaking or enabling is, to the best efforts of that person that's trying to take care, nothing really seems to help. Nothing really seems to change. And what an isolating and sad place to be in, that my best help just isn't helping. So what that creates is patterns where the disease process is possible and sometimes even easier to continue. The difficult part of shifting some of these behaviors is helping the person that's invested in those unhealthy caretaking behaviors to really see the power of putting that down, of taking a step back and making a shift in their own behaviors, and where that actually does more towards supporting the situation and managing outcomes than trying to actively fix, control, or help. The spiritual impact of these behaviors on the person that's exhibiting them is really isolating. It disconnects the primary enabler from survival, from being able to, or it puts them in a state of survival and disconnects from those meaningful experiences, from the ability to really be in connection with another person, be in connection even with an identified patient in a way that we can start to rebuild some of those healthy processes. So as Sam said before, what can be done about it? Really, the first step is acknowledging that that exists and being willing to put down that rope, not tugging anymore, not trying to fix, control, or help, and seeing where the behaviors that are happening within the family system aren't working. Because the truth of the matter is that mental health issues and substance use disorders are progressive illnesses. They're chronic. They progress over time, they don't stay the same, and they require consistent effort in treatment and in recovery to sustain change. What we look for is the ability for a loved one, for a family member, to really take that focus away from the identified patient, to remove themselves from this pattern where there aren't relationships that are happening in a healthy way, to step outside of that and say, I can no longer manage this cycle, but what I can do is I can come over here and acknowledge my own space. I can acknowledge my own feelings. I can share the spaces where I feel guilty about what's happened, the spaces where I'm scared about what may come next. Anyone that comes into a process like this would really prefer recovery to be linear. And the truth of the matter is it's just not a linear process. Sometimes it has tangles, it has circles, it has ups and downs, and it feels a little more like a roller coaster. Sometimes it feels like 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, and ultimately the healing process in becoming a change agent and facilitating that shift to happen within the family contributes to a general upward trend. And recovery happens in general upward trends, not in a linear fashion. So in conclusion, really taking the space and taking the time and having the courage to say, I can't do this on my own, that I am not able to be the only support to manage, to fix, to help, to solve any of the challenges for another person. The only thing that I can work on in that moment is myself. Leads to acknowledgement that there is a disease process to start with, decreasing those denial behaviors and combating those symptoms of codependency that we talked about earlier. Seeing disease process really for what it is, and seeing that that identified patient is sick, not just making bad choices. Shifting the patterns of attempts to control, attempts to fix, attempts to cure, and accessing empowering into a person's own strength, a person's own power to make changes in their own life, and then impact the family system in a healthy way by doing that. Impact the ability to develop relationships with one another in a family system, with the identified patient, and with everyone else that's there as well.